Can you hear me? Okay, the main cause of obesity is lack of willpower. First one, quick analysis. There's lots of causes to obesity. We're going to be looking at the main cause. So there are two reasons why the main cause of obesity is the lack of willpower. The first you can tag as lack of will to stop eating. First off, we treat obesity like it's a disease, but it's absolutely something you can stop doing. You can stop eating food, and doing that will detract from your obesity. The second main reason is the lack of willpower to get help. Now, this is the other issue. It's not just a lack of willpower, like, oh, pull yourself up from your bootstraps and save your own life. No, it's the lack of willpower to get help. Healthcare is accessible to most people. You can access healthy food really cheaply at Walmart. Spinach is super cheap. You can get healthy food. You can get healthcare. You can go online and work out and Google this information. This lack of willpower to get help and also the lack of willpower to improve are the main causes of obesity.
Well, okay, so hey, Drew, I've got three reasons why it's not really the case. First of all, we have genetic reasons. Now, there are a ton of genetic research showing that people actually are predisposed to obesity by showing that they're actually their families are much more likely to be obese among obese people. There's really a lot of research showing that genetics play an enormous role in obesity, and that's not really one that we can discredit. Secondly, we talk about diseases. We can talk about how who have these diseases that cause them to be predisposed or really cause them to be obese. There's a lot of disease involved here. That's not something that lack of willpower can solve. Thirdly, there's the fact of community factors. Now, communities are often different, and obesity is something that's particularly prevalent among poor people. Poor people tend to live in neighborhoods where there's not as much access to good food, not as much access to physicians, not as much access to the kind of things they need to actually execute their willpower. It's much easier to get food at McDonald's than it is to get it at Whole Foods among poor communities.
So my opponent brings up three main arguments. I have one group response, and then we'll talk about them individually. My group response is outliers. We're talking about the main cause of obesity here. My opponent talks about genetic reasoning, he talks about diseases, and he talks about communities. These are all outliers to obesity here. We need to talk about the main cause. And that's my second response, no alternate cause. My opponent gives you three sort of minor causes, and while I'd agree, these all are contributing factors, none of them are big enough to be the main cause. Let's get into each of them. Under genetic reasons and diseases, I have one response here, which is reversible. Obesity is absolutely reversible. Yes, it can be something you have a problem with, but it's reversible if you gain the willpower to seek help and improve, the two things I talked about. Under community factors, my response is first world problem. If poverty really was an issue that was the main cause of obesity, then Nigeria would be full of obese people. That's not the issue. The issue, however, is people's lack of willpower. And remember, there's way easy access.
Okay, so let's talk about these issues, starting with the first point that they're outliers. Now, I think my opponent missed the point I was making here. I'm saying that we can't qualify as lack of willpower the main cause of obesity when there are so many other causes that are probably more significant. And these are things I was saying was more significant than just the lack of willpower. First of all, we talk about genetics. Now, genetics is something that's present in a lot of obese people. There's actually the genetic predisposition to be obese. That's something that may be reversible, but it's not something that lack of willpower alone is responsible for. Secondly, we talked about diseases, didn't respond to this point. Again, these diseases are not really reversible for the most part. Thirdly, we talked about community, and its response is the first world problem. But I don't think he really understands the nature of poverty in America. In America, it's way easier to go to McDonald's than it is to get Whole Foods to get food. That's not the case in Nigeria because of very specific societal factors. But in America, most people who are poor, most people who are obese are poor. And that's because of their community factors, not necessarily because
to something my opponent said, which is it's easier to go to McDonald's than Whole Foods. I absolutely agree. It takes willpower to walk into Walmart and buy spinach. It's absolutely easier to just resign yourself to it. Say, I'm going to eat a quarter pounder now because there's nothing there's nothing easier for me. It does take willpower. By my opponent's own admission here, it takes more willpower to eat healthy, which means it's the main cause of obesity. Under genetic reasons and diseases, you say they play more of a contributing factor. My response is still reversible. You say they still have such a contributing factor. That's not true. My opponent is saying literally it is almost impossible to escape obesity. I'm saying there's a way out. You have to seek help and look to improve. My other main argument here is that spinach is cheap. Once again, this is accessible. Willpower is the issue here. Like my opponent said, it's easier to go to McDonald's than Whole Foods. However, both are accessible options. You just have to have the willpower.
Okay, so my opponent talked about the whole idea of the way easier to go to McDonald's than it is to go to Whole Foods. I don't think my opponent got what I was saying here. I'm not saying that it's just easier. I'm saying that it actually is something that they don't really have a choice about. Because if you're living in a poor community in which you don't have access to resources such as a physician, such as very much money at all, what I mean way easier is that it's way monetarily easier. You can't really afford to do everything. You don't have access to the resources involved there. So that's what I'm saying when it's way easier. It's not something that I'm saying they can just avoid, they can just choose to do better. So then he talks again about it being reversible. And my response is, again, these are things that aren't really reversible. You can't reverse your genetics. You can't reverse your disease. That's something that's a bigger contributor to obesity than the lack of willpower. That's the actual cause of obesity, not the lack of willpower in these cases. I'm passing the mic back.
I have a few main arguments here. The first is spinach is at Walmart. My opponent is saying poor people don't have access to healthy food. Walmart is sold, or spinach is sold at Walmart, and there's Walmarts everywhere. You can get healthy food no matter if you're poor or rich. Also, spinach is cheap. You can get healthy vegetables, fruits, meats, proteins, whatever you need at Walmart. Just takes willpower. Then he says, well, they still might not have resources to healthcare or anything like that. My first response is free online resources. You can Google, how do I eat healthier? How do I get healthy? You might say we might not have a computer. Go to a library, use a free computer, and get these free online resources. The third is working out. My opponent says, oh, this is genetic. You can't reverse it. You can work out. You don't need a gym membership. You can do push-ups in your backyard and work out to gain back that obesity. My opponent paints the picture of a world where obesity is a death sentence and there's nothing you can do about it. That's simply not true.
I'm not saying that obesity is a death sentence. What I am saying, though, is that it's not the main cause, the fact that you don't have the willpower to get out of it. We've talked about the fact that people in poor communities don't have these resources. And my opponent's response to this was that spinach at Walmart is cheap. My response is the idea of food deserts. Now, there's such a thing as food deserts in which people don't have access to the food that they need. They don't have access to alternatives. They're not grocery stores that were within their access. This is a thing that happens in America, and it's something that's going to contribute to obesity. Spinach at Walmart may be cheap, but if you don't have access to spinach at Walmart, then it doesn't matter. He then talked about how people do have resources because they're free online and they can go work out. But again, these are things that you don't necessarily have the right planning to do. If you have a genetic disease and you can't really do anything about it just by looking online on WebMD, you just don't have the resources necessarily to do this. If you don't know what sites to trust or anything. So then again, the fact is the main cause of obesity is not this lack of willpower. There are plenty of other causes. And
this debate round comes down to one main argument. You can write it down as outliers versus general principles. My opponent says food deserts exist. I agree. However, most of the poor people in America live in urban communities such as Detroit, Chicago, New York City, Los Angeles, where you can go find a Walmart. Food deserts exist. They're an outlier rather than a general principle. My opponent also talks about how your genetics will keep you from working out. This is simply not true. And if it is true, it's definitely an outlier. For in this whole argument about genetics in the first part, my opponents offered you no warrant, and it's an outlier if it's even true. Simply put, you can reverse. You can go get those free online resources. You can work out. There's absolutely hope. You just have to have the willpower.
okay, let's talk about these issues. Now, my opponent says this is all outliers versus principles, and he talks about the idea of food deserts. Now, I don't think he really understands the concept of a food desert. A food desert is not something that happens in rural Iowa. It's a thing that happens in inner city Detroit. Like these cities do have food deserts. That's where the food deserts actually are, in the cities where there are lots of poor people and where there's a poor community. So this actually does definitely apply. I'm not saying that what I'm saying here when I'm pointing out these three different causes is that these are the big causes of obesity. These are the causes that actually lead to obesity. Lack of willpower, as I'll say in just a minute when I respond to the genetics argument, isn't. Now, my opponent says, again, we're talking about genetics and that's an outlier. But I'm talking about the cause versus the solution. Now, my opponent says that the cause of obesity is not having the willpower. Now, that's the thing about the solution, though. If we accept all my opponent's arguments, what he's saying there is that the solution is to get the willpower. But the cause, the reason we have obesity in the first place is not because of that. It's because of the reasons I mentioned.
The cause versus solution argument has nothing to do with today's debate because people choose to eat a hamburger instead of a spinach, and that's what starts obesity. That's what we're talking about here. And then you continue to remain in obesity because of your lack of willpower. The first cause is lack of willpower, and the final cause is lack of willpower. Now, that's all the argument comes down to, general principles.
Okay, so what I've said and what I'll continue to say is these are the principal